Have you ever sent a text that changed your entire life? Jake Morrison, a 35-year-old single father, was about to find out exactly what that felt like. His thumb hovered over the phone screen as he sat in his Honda Accord outside Riverside Elementary, watching Harper disappear through the double doors with her purple backpack bouncing against her shoulders. The September morning air carried the first hint of autumn, that particular Boston chill that reminded him 3 years had passed since everything fell apart. The meeting with Catherine Reynolds still played in his mind. 6 months since the merger, and he still couldn't get used to having a CEO who looked like she belonged on a magazine cover rather than behind a desk. Today she'd worn navy blue, the kind of professional dress that somehow managed to be both completely appropriate and utterly distracting. Jake had spent the entire quarterly review trying to focus on his presentation slides instead of the way the morning light from her corner office windows caught the gold in her hair. He pulled out his phone, needing to tell someone before the thought drove him crazy. Connor would understand. Connor always understood. Dude, the new CEO is absolutely stunning. That navy dress should be illegal. Can't focus in meetings anymore. This is bad, really bad. He hit send without thinking twice, the message disappearing into the digital void. His phone buzzed immediately. Jake's stomach dropped as the notification appeared at the top of his screen. Message delivered to Catherine Reynolds. The world seemed to tilt sideways. His hands started shaking so badly he nearly dropped the phone. 3 dots appeared at the bottom of the screen. Disappeared. Appeared again. Each second stretched into an eternity while Jake's mind raced through a catastrophic slideshow of consequences. He'd lose his job. How would he pay the mortgage? Harper's therapy sessions cost $200 a week, even with insurance. The medical bills from Sarah's treatment still arrived, monthly little paper reminders that death was expensive and grief didn't come with a payment plan. The dots vanished. Then finally her response appeared. My office. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp. Jake stared at the words until they blurred. Tomorrow, 18 hours to figure out how to explain the inexplicable, to apologize for the unforgivable, to somehow convince Catherine Reynolds that he deserved to keep the job that barely paid enough to keep them afloat. The memory hit him without warning, the way they always did. Sarah's funeral 3 years ago, standing in the rain while a minister who'd never met his wife read generic platitudes about God's plan. Harper's small hand clutching his, her 8-year-old fingers squeezing so hard his knuckles went white. He'd promised Sarah in those final hospital days, when the morphine made her drift between sleep and something darker, that he'd take care of their daughter, that he'd be strong enough for both of them. Some promises were harder to keep than others. Jake started the car and drove toward the office on autopilot, his usual route through downtown Boston, a blur of red lights and construction detours. The routine had become his anchor over the past 3 years. Drop Harper at school by 8, office by 8:30, lunch at his desk, pick up Harper at 3:15, homework, dinner, bedtime stories, then collapse on the couch with his laptop to finish whatever work couldn't wait until morning. Repeat. The monotony was exhausting and comforting, in equal measure a treadmill that kept moving forward even when he felt stuck in place. Dating wasn't even on the radar. How could it be, between single parenting and a demanding job at a publishing company that had just been swallowed by a media conglomerate, Jake barely had time to sleep, let alone consider the complicated landscape of romance. Besides, the guilt made sure of that. Every time he caught himself noticing an attractive woman, every moment his mind wandered toward possibilities that didn't include Sarah. A voice in his head asked the same question. Isn't 3 years too soon? Margaret Holloway would probably say no. His therapist had been gently pushing him toward considering the future for the past 6 months, ever since their weekly sessions shifted from acute grief management to something more nebulous she called rebuilding. Jake wasn't sure he wanted to rebuild. Survival felt like enough of an accomplishment. The merger had complicated everything. 6 months ago, the small independent publishing house where Jake had worked for 2 years got absorbed by Reynolds Media Group. Most of his colleagues had been let go within the first week, their positions deemed redundant or unnecessary in the new corporate structure. Jake had survived the cuts purely because of his Q3 campaign for their lifestyle magazine brand, a digital strategy that had somehow tripled their under 35 readership and caught the attention of the new regime. Catherine Reynolds had taken over the company from her father, Robert, after his stroke left him unable to continue. At 33, with an MBA from Stanford and 5 years at McKinsey under her belt, She'd walked into Reynolds Media Group like a general surveying a battlefield. The board, populated mostly by men who'd worked with her father for decades, watched her every move with barely concealed skepticism. Richard Blackwood, the COO, and Robert's oldest friend seemed particularly eager to find cracks in her armor. Jake had been promoted to marketing director 2 months after the merger, a decision Catherine made personally over Richard's objections. He'd heard them arguing through her office walls about risk and tradition and the importance of proven experience. Catherine's voice had cut through the debate with cold precision. Results matter, she'd said, not tenure. Jake had gone home that night and updated his resume anyway, just in case. Now he'd just sent his boss a text calling her stunning. Tomorrow morning, he'd find out if results still mattered more than spectacularly bad judgment. The rest of the day crawled by in a haze of anxiety. Jake couldn't focus on the brand refresh proposal sitting open on his laptop screen. Every notification made his heart race. He left the office at 3 to pick up Harper, grateful for the excuse to escape. She climbed into the back seat with the same fierce independence she'd developed after Sarah died, refusing his help with her backpack and buckling herself in with determined concentration. Harper had her mother's dark hair and Jake's gray eyes, a combination that made strangers stop them to comment on how beautiful she was. She hated the attention, just like Sarah had. The drive home was quiet. Harper pulled out a library book and disappeared into whatever fantasy world offered more appeal than the view outside her window. Jake watched her in the rearview mirror and wondered not for the first time how much damage he was doing by being the only parent she had left. Dr. Evelyn Sinclair, Harper's child psychologist, kept assuring him that his daughter was processing her grief in healthy ways. Jake wasn't sure what healthy grief looked like when you lost your mother before you learned multiplication. Dinner was spaghetti from a boxed garlic bread from the freezer and a side salad that Harper picked at with theatrical disgust. They ate at the kitchen table while Jake asked the standard questions about her day and received the standard 8-year-old responses. Yes, school was fine. No, she didn't have homework. Yes, she ate her lunch. They'd developed a script, and neither of them had the energy to deviate from it. After Harper went to bed, Jake sat in the darkness of his living room and stared at his phone. Connor's name sat at the top of his recent messages, right below Catherine's devastating response. He should call his best friend, explain what happened, get some advice or at least some sympathy. Instead, Jake opened his photo album and scrolled back 3 years to the pictures he couldn't bring himself to delete. Sarah smiled at him from a dozen frozen moments. Their wedding day, her white dress bright against the green of the botanical garden where they had exchanged vows. Harper's birth, Wyron exhausted and glowing in her hospital bed. Birthday parties, Thanksgivings, random Tuesday afternoons when the light was good and happiness felt permanent. The last photo was from the hospital 2 weeks before she died. Sarah had insisted, making Jake promise to take pictures even when she looked like a shadow of herself. For Harper, she'd whispered, "So she remembers I was here." Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams about job interviews and eviction notices, and Harper asking why they had to move away from the only home she remembered. Morning arrived too quickly. Jake dropped Harper at school 15 minutes early, then sat in his car watching the clock tick toward 8. He dressed in his best suit, the charcoal gray one Sarah had bought him for their 5th anniversary. If Catherine was going to fire him, at least he'd look professional when it happened. The Reynolds Media Group building loomed over downtown Boston like a glass and steel monument to corporate ambition. Jake rode the elevator to the executive floor with his stomach churning and his palms sweating through his carefully ironed shirt. Jennifer Hayes. Catherine's executive assistant looked up from her desk as he approached. Her expression held equal parts sympathy and amusement. She waved him toward Catherine's door. Without a word, but her lips quirked into something that might have been a smile if she'd allowed it to fully form. "Good luck," her eyes said. "You'll need it." Jake knocked twice and heard Catherine's voice from inside, cool and controlled, and giving nothing away. He opened the door and stepped into what felt like his own execution. Catherine's corner office was exactly what he'd expected from someone who'd spent 5 years at McKinsey. Minimalist furniture, strategic pops of color, and floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Boston Harbor like a painting. She sat behind her desk with the morning sun streaming in behind her, turning her into a backlit silhouette that revealed nothing of her expression. Jake stood awkwardly near the door, unsure whether to sit without permission or keep standing like a student called to the principal's office. His prepared apology evaporated somewhere between his brain and his mouth. Catherine let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. then leaned forward into the light. Her face was unreadable professional in that carefully cultivated way that could mean anything or nothing. "Sit down, Jake." He sat. The leather chair was too comfortable for what was about to happen. Catherine slid a manila folder across her pristine desk, the movement precise and deliberate. Jake stared at it, wondering if it contained his termination paperwork or evidence of every other professional mistake he'd made in 6 months. The Camden Magazine account. "They're looking for a fresh approach to their relaunch campaign. I want you to lead it." The words didn't make sense at first. Jake's brain had been so thoroughly prepared for disaster that it took several seconds to process what she'd actually said. He looked up, confusion written all over his face. "I... what?" Catherine's expression shifted slightly, the corner of her mouth threatening to curve into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't entirely professional either. "You're not firing me." "Should I? Most people would." Jake felt relief and embarrassment crash into each other somewhere in his chest. His carefully prepared apology tumbled out anyway, words tripping over themselves in their rush to escape. "I'm so incredibly sorry about last night's text. It was completely unprofessional and inappropriate, and I understand if you want to reconsider." Catherine held up one hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. Her voice stayed level, giving away nothing except perhaps a hint of amusement buried deep beneath her CEO armor. "I'm not most people, Jake. Your Q3 campaign increased engagement by 34% and brought in two major advertisers who'd written us off as too traditional to bother with. I'd be stupid to fire talent over a misguided compliment." The pause before those last two words felt deliberate, like she was choosing them carefully from a larger vocabulary of possible responses. Jake wanted to sink through the expensive office chair and disappear into the carpet. "It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't." Catherine opened the folder and started walking him through the Camden opportunity, her voice shifting into the brisk efficiency he'd observed in board meetings. The magazine was hemorrhaging readers, their editorial direction stuck somewhere in the 1990s, while their target demographic had moved online. Camden's board wanted a complete digital overhaul, with enough respect for their legacy that longtime subscribers wouldn't revolt. It was exactly the kind of challenge that would normally excite Jake if he wasn't still processing the fact that he had a job to go back to. But something else emerged from the conversation, something Jake hadn't expected to find in Catherine Reynolds' corner office: vulnerability. She mentioned the board's resistance to her decisions, the constant questioning of her judgment, the way Richard Blackwood and his allies waited for any excuse to prove she wasn't ready for the role her father had given her. The admission came wrapped in professional language and delivered with her trademark composure. But Jake recognized the undertone. Catherine was under siege in her own company. "Richard and the old guard are waiting for me to make a mistake," she said, her fingers drumming once against the folder before she stilled them. "Don't give them ammunition by making this a thing." Her eyes met his directly for the first time since he'd entered the office. Jake saw the calculation there, the risk assessment, the decision she'd already made to trust him, despite having every reason not to. Something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with professional gratitude. "We both have too much to lose." "Agreed," Jake nodded, not trusting his voice to stay steady. Catherine leaned back in her chair, the morning sun catching the gold in her hair, exactly the way it had yesterday, the way that had led to his catastrophic text message in the first place. "The presentation is in 2 weeks. Don't make me regret this decision." He stood on shaking legs and made it to the door before his curiosity overrode his common sense. Jake turned back, finding Catherine still watching him with that unreadable expression that could have meant anything. "Why didn't you fire me?" The question hung between them for a long moment. Catherine tilted her head slightly, considering her answer with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. "Because I need people who see things clearly, even when they probably shouldn't say them out loud. And because..." She paused, something flickering across her face too quickly for Jake to identify. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Jake walked out of her office feeling like he'd survived something more complicated than a near termination. Jennifer looked up from her computer with raised eyebrows, clearly surprised to see him leaving under his own power. He managed a weak smile and headed for the elevator, his mind already racing toward the Camden project and away from the dangerous territory of wondering what Catherine had really meant by that last statement. But as the elevator doors started to close, Jake glanced back down the hallway and caught Catherine standing at her office window watching him go. Their eyes met for half a second before she turned away, and Jake spent the entire ride down trying to convince himself he'd imagined the look on her face. The next 6 weeks unfolded in a pattern that felt simultaneously professional and dangerous. Jake threw himself into the Camden campaign with the kind of focus that came from knowing his second chance couldn't afford to be wasted. He researched 40 years of magazine archives, interviewed former editors and readers, analyzed competitor strategies and market trends until he could recite circulation numbers in his sleep. The work required regular meetings with Catherine, brief encounters that stayed firmly in the safe territory of business discussions. At first. But gradually, as September bled into October and the Boston weather shifted from warm to cool to genuinely cold, something began to shift in the space between them. The meetings grew longer. What started as 15-minute status updates stretched to 30, then 45 minutes. They'd move from Catherine's office to the small conference room down the hall, spreading research and mock-ups across the table while debating target demographics and brand positioning. Catherine had opinions, strong ones backed by her McKinsey training and her years watching her father build the company. Jake pushed back when he disagreed, which was often, and Catherine seemed to appreciate the challenge rather than resent it. Coffee became part of their routine. Catherine would order from the cafe downstairs, remembering without asking that Jake took his black while she preferred a cappuccino with an extra shot. They'd work through lunch ordering sandwiches that sat half-eaten, while they argued about font choices and color schemes and whether their target audience would respond better to nostalgia or aspiration. One Wednesday evening in mid-October, Jake's phone rang during a particularly heated debate about homepage layout. Harper's name flashed on the screen, and he answered immediately, his voice shifting into the gentle tone he reserved for his daughter. "Nightmare," she whispered, still half asleep. "Can you come home?" He talked her through the breathing exercise that Dr. Sinclair had taught them, his voice low and soothing, while Catherine sat across the table pretending to study her laptop screen. When Harper's breathing finally evened out and she mumbled goodnight, Jake ended the call, to find Catherine watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Sorry about that. Don't apologize. That was—" Catherine paused, searching for the right word. "Sweet. You're good with her." Jake shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation. Being a good father felt less like a skill and more like desperately trying not to screw up something impossibly important. "I try. Some days are harder than others." Catherine nodded, and for a moment, something passed between them that felt less like a professional exchange and more like mutual recognition. Then she stood gathering her papers with the efficient movements that signaled the meeting was over. "You should go home. Harper needs you." But Jake found himself reluctant to leave, surprised by the realization that these late-night work sessions had become the highlight of his days. The thought was dangerous enough that he pushed it away and focused on packing up his laptop. The personal conversation started small. Catherine mentioned growing up in boarding schools after her mother died, a childhood spent trying to live up to her father's expectations. Jake found himself sharing more than he intended about Sarah's illness, the brutal 8 months between diagnosis and death, the way grief felt like carrying a weight that never got lighter, even when you learned how to balance it better. They discovered unexpected common ground. Both of them understood loneliness, the kind that came from having responsibilities that didn't leave room for much else. Catherine admitted that running Reynolds Media Group meant sacrificing any pretense of a personal life. Jake confessed that being a single father left him too exhausted and guilty to even consider dating. "Guilty?" Catherine asked one evening in late October, looking up from the campaign mock-ups spread across the conference table. Jake hesitated, unsure how much truth was appropriate to share with his boss. But something about the way Catherine waited, patient and genuinely curious, made him continue. "Sarah's only been gone 3 years. Sometimes it feels like moving on would be, I don't know, disrespectful. Like I'm supposed to stay stuck in that moment forever." Catherine's expression softened in a way he'd never seen before, the CEO armor bar cracking just enough to reveal the woman underneath. "I don't think grief works that way. We're allowed to keep living even when the people we love can't." The words settled between them, simple and profound and impossible to unhear. Jake found himself studying Catherine's face, noticing for the first time the faint shadows under her eyes that suggested she slept as poorly as he did. The observation felt too intimate, so he looked away and pretended to be fascinated by his notes. The night everything shifted started like all the others. Late October brought early darkness and the kind of cold rain that made Boston feel particularly miserable. Jake and Catherine were the last ones left in the office working past midnight on final revisions to the Camden presentation. They'd ordered Chinese food hours ago, the empty containers now cluttering one end of the conference table. Catherine reached for the last dumpling in the takeout box at the same moment Jake did. Their hands collided, fingers brushing in a contact that lasted maybe 2 seconds, but felt infinitely longer. They both froze, hands still touching close enough that Jake could smell Catherine's perfume underneath the scent of cold sesame noodles. Catherine pulled back first, her professional mask sliding into place so quickly Jake almost convinced himself he'd imagined the moment. Almost. You take it. Jake left the dumpling untouched and mumbled something about needing to get home to Harper. He gathered his things in a rush, avoiding Catherine's eyes, and practically fled to the elevator. The entire drive home, his mind kept replaying those 2 seconds of contact, analyzing every possible meaning and finding none that didn't lead to complicated places he had no business exploring. The next morning brought an email from Harper's school. Could he come in for a conference? His daughter had been getting into arguments with classmates and her teacher was concerned. Jake's stomach dropped. Harper had been doing so well lately, or at least he'd thought she had. Dr. Sinclair's therapy sessions seemed to be helping. The nightmares had decreased. She'd started smiling again, small moments of genuine happiness that felt like victories. Apparently, he'd missed something important. The parent-teacher conference happened during Jake's lunch break, a rushed meeting in Mrs. Garcia's classroom, while Harper sat outside in the hall. The teacher was kind but firm. Harper was struggling socially. The other kids didn't know how to act around the girl whose mother had died. Harper had responded by either withdrawing completely or lashing out when they said the wrong thing, which they inevitably did because 8-year-olds had all the emotional intelligence of particularly confused goldfish. She needs stability, Mrs. Garcia said, her voice gentle but pointed, and perhaps some female influence in her life, someone who can help her navigate these social situations in ways that might be easier coming from a woman. Jake drove back to the office with the teacher's words echoing in his head. Female influence, like he could just conjure up a mother figure for his daughter because she needed one. Like the world worked that way, simple and clean, instead of the complicated mess it actually was. That evening after Harper was asleep, Jake finally called Connor Blake. His best friend answered on the second ring, sounding harried and exhausted in that universal tone of single fathers who just survived bedtime routines with multiple children. Please tell me you're calling with good news because I've had 3 meltdowns today, and only one of them was mine. Despite everything, Jake smiled. Connor's divorce had been finalized a year ago, leaving him with joint custody of 2 kids and a newfound appreciation for how difficult single parenting actually was. They'd bonded over their shared chaos meeting most Saturday mornings, so their kids could play while the fathers drank terrible coffee and compared notes on surviving the week. Jake told him about the text message, the meeting with Catherine, the Camden project, and the growing sense that he was standing at the edge of something he didn't know how to navigate. Connor listened without interrupting, a skill he'd developed through years of friendship and a natural understanding of when to offer advice versus when to simply be present. When Jake finally ran out of words, Connor was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke with the kind of directness that made their friendship work even when the truth was uncomfortable. Jake, you're not betraying Sarah by living. You honor her by being a good father and a good man. That's it. That's the whole assignment. The words hit harder than Jake expected, cracking something open in his chest that he'd been keeping carefully sealed. His eyes burned with tears. He hadn't let himself cry in months. It's only been 3 years. And it could be 10 years or 20 years, and you'd still feel guilty because that's who you are. But Harper needs a father who's present, not one who's punishing himself for being alive. And maybe, Connor paused, choosing his words carefully, maybe you need to consider whether guilt is actually helping anyone or if it's just another way to avoid the scary parts of moving forward. Jake ended the call 20 minutes later, no closer to answers, but somehow feeling lighter anyway. He opened his laptop to work on the Camden presentation and found an email from Catherine sent an hour ago. How's Harper still struggling with nightmares? The question was simple professional concern from a boss who'd overheard a phone call. But Jake stared at it for a long time, wondering why Catherine Reynolds cared enough to ask, and what it meant that her caring made his chest feel tight in ways he wasn't ready to examine. He typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on something brief and honest. She's hanging in there, we both are. Catherine's response came back almost immediately, like she'd been waiting for his reply. For what it's worth, I think you're doing an incredible job. Harper's lucky to have you. Jake closed his laptop without responding, afraid of what he might say if he let himself keep typing. The Camden presentation was in 2 weeks. After that, these late-night working sessions would end, and he could go back to the safe distance of quarterly reports and professional boundaries. He just needed to hold on until then. Except the universe had different plans delivered in the form of a crisis 3 days before the Camden presentation was scheduled. The client had moved up their timeline. Could Reynolds Media Group present in 2 days instead of 2 weeks? Jake's carefully constructed schedule imploded. He had meetings he couldn't cancel, a parent-teacher conference follow-up with Harper's school, and a Thursday afternoon he'd blocked off for Harper's school performance that he absolutely could not miss. Catherine found him in his office Wednesday morning, stress radiating off him in visible waves. He'd been staring at his calendar for 20 minutes, trying to solve an equation that had no good answer. Talk to me. Jake explained the situation, words tumbling out in a rush of logistical nightmare. He could make the emergency client meeting work if he pushed other things, but Harper's performance was non-negotiable. She was doing a solo piece in the school concert, her first time performing alone since Sarah died. Mrs. Garcia had specifically mentioned it as a breakthrough moment. Missing it would devastate his daughter and prove every fear he had about being an inadequate parent. Catherine listened with the focused attention she brought to complex problems, her mind clearly working through possible solutions. When Jake finished his explanation, she asked a question that surprised him. What if I picked her what? From school, I could get Harper to her performance while you handle the client meeting. You'd join us there afterward. Jake stared at his boss, trying to process the offer. Catherine Reynolds, CEO of a media conglomerate, volunteering to provide childcare for his 8-year-old daughter. The suggestion was so far outside anything he'd expected that his brain short-circuited trying to formulate a response. You don't have to do that. Catherine's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement if she'd let it show more clearly. I know I don't have to. I'm offering because you need help and I have a car service. Harper won't be alone. I'll take her to the concert, you meet us there. Problem solved. Every instinct told Jake to say no. Asking his boss to pick up his daughter crossed about 17 professional boundaries and set a precedent he couldn't afford to normalize. But the alternative meant missing Harper's solo, and that wasn't an option his conscience could accept. He gave Catherine his ex-wife's no, his late wife's no, just Sarah's emergency contact information and Harper's school address. Catherine programmed it into her phone with the same efficiency she brought to board meetings, like chauffeuring employees' children was just another item on her executive to-do list. Thursday afternoon arrived with the particular chaos that comes from trying to do too many important things simultaneously. The client meeting ran long, complicated questions, extending past the time Jake had budgeted for transit. He sent Catherine a panicked text apologizing for the delay and promising to get there as soon as humanly possible. Her response was brief and unruffled. We're fine, Harper's warming up backstage. Take your time. Jake made it to the school auditorium 15 minutes before Harper's solo, sweating through his suit jacket and slightly out of breath from sprinting across the parking lot. He scanned the crowded room for Catherine and found her sitting in the third row, Harper beside her, chattering away about something that had his daughter genuinely animated. They hadn't noticed him yet. Jake hung back, watching the impossible scene unfold. Catherine Reynolds, in her designer suit and executive posture, was leaning down to listen to Harper's 8-year-old explanation of something clearly important. His daughter's hands moved expressively, her face lit up in a way Jake hadn't seen in months. And Catherine was smiling, a real smile that had nothing to do with professional courtesy and everything to do with genuine connection. Harper spotted him and waved enthusiastically. Catherine looked up, meeting Jake's eyes across the auditorium. Something passed between them in that moment, something warm and complicated that Jake immediately tried to pretend he hadn't felt. He made his way to the third row and slid into the seat beside Harper, who immediately launched into a recap of everything he'd missed. Catherine had picked her up exactly on time. They'd talked about science in the car because Harper mentioned her favorite subject. Catherine had bought her a granola bar from the vending machine when Harper admitted to being hungry, and Catherine had told her the secret to not being nervous before performances, which was to pretend you're just telling a story to one friend instead of performing for a crowd. Jake listened to his daughter's enthusiastic narration and felt something crack open in his chest, warm and terrifying, and impossible to name. Harper's solo went perfectly. She stood on the stage in her school uniform, her voice clear and steady, through a song about autumn leaves and changing seasons. Jake watched his daughter and thought about all the moments Sarah was missing, all the performances and achievements and ordinary miracles that made up Harper's childhood. The grief was there, familiar and heavy, but something else accompanied it now. Hope, maybe, or possibility. After the concert, Harper hugged Catherine with the kind of fierce affection she usually reserved for family. Catherine hugged her back, looking slightly overwhelmed, but genuinely pleased. Jake thanked her 3 times in 30 seconds, unable to articulate the depth of his gratitude without sounding like he was saying too much. As they walked to their cars in the crisp November evening, Harper slipped her hand into Catherine's without hesitation. Jake's heart did something complicated in his chest. His daughter, who hadn't voluntarily touched anyone outside immediate family since Sarah died, had just chosen to hold Catherine Reynolds' hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Catherine looked down at Harper, then up at Jake, and the expression on her face was tender and vulnerable and scared in equal measure. They stood in the parking lot under the glow of streetlights while Harper chattered about the performance, and Jake realized with sudden clarity that the danger he'd been worried about wasn't falling for his boss. It was that Harper was falling for her, too. The Camden presentation happened the following week, exactly 8 weeks after Jake's catastrophic text message. The conference room on the 15th floor was packed with executives, the full Reynolds Media Group board, Camden Magazine's leadership team, and enough vice presidents to make the space feel uncomfortably crowded. Richard Blackwood sat in the second row with the satisfied expression of someone waiting for disaster. Jake had spent the previous 72 hours refining every slide, rehearsing every transition, preparing for every possible question. The presentation represented 2 months of work, and his best shot at proving Catherine's faith in him wasn't misplaced. Harper had wished him good luck that morning with a hug that lingered just long enough to make his eyes sting. The pitch itself went smoothly for the first 20 minutes. Jake walked through his research, outlined the strategic approach, and presented mock-ups that balanced Camden's legacy brand with the digital-first direction their survival required. He could see heads nodding, executives taking notes, the client team leaning forward with engagement. Then Richard Blackwood raised his hand. "This approach is too risky. Camden's readership skews older. You're proposing we abandon our core demographic to chase a younger audience that's notoriously fickle and difficult to monetize." Jake had anticipated the objection. He pulled up the slide showing Camden's declining circulation numbers over the past decade, the demographic data that made clear their core audience was aging out faster than they were gaining new readers. "With respect, Mr. Blackwood, we're not abandoning anyone. We're expanding to survive. Camden's current trajectory leads to irrelevance within 5 years. This strategy pivots us toward growth while respecting the legacy that makes Camden worth saving in the first place." Richard's expression hardened. He looked past Jake to where Catherine sat at the head of the table, her face professionally neutral. "I hope you know what you're doing betting on unproven talent. The board has concerns about judgment calls that prioritize flash over substance." The implicit criticism hung in the air, directed at Catherine more than Jake. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Jake saw Catherine's jaw tighten fractionally, the only sign that Richard's comment had landed. She stood, and the room's attention pivoted to her immediately. Catherine's voice came out cool and measured, the McKinsey consultant delivering data-driven counter-arguments to emotional resistance. "The Q3 numbers don't lie. Jake's digital strategy increased engagement by 41% and brought in 3 major advertising accounts. His Camden campaign isn't flash. It's strategic evolution based on market research and consumer behavior analysis. Sometimes playing it safe is the riskiest move we can make." Richard looked like he wanted to argue further, but the Camden CEO cut him off with a raised hand. The older man had been studying Jake's presentation materials with increasing interest, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. Mr. Morrison, this is certainly bold, but I'm concerned about authenticity. How do we modernize without losing the voice that's made Camden relevant for 40 years? This was the question Jake had been preparing for the heart of everything he'd spent 8 weeks trying to solve. He took a breath and let the answer come from somewhere deeper than research and strategy. I spent 2 months reading Camden archives, sir. Every decade you've reinvented your approach while keeping your core editorial voice intact. The transition from print-only to digital platforms isn't different from the transition to color printing in the 70s or adding photography in the 50s or any other evolution that felt radical at the time. Camden has always been about quality storytelling. This campaign just recognizes that your readers now consume those stories differently than they did 40 years ago. Jake pulled up his final slide, a quote from Camden's founding editorial statement, alongside mock-ups showing how that same philosophy translated to modern platforms. He'd spent hours crafting this connection, finding the thread that linked past and future. Experience isn't doing the same thing for 40 years. It's learning for 40 years and applying what you learned. Camden has that institutional knowledge. We're not asking you to abandon it. We're asking you to trust it enough to let it evolve. Silence filled the conference room. Jake couldn't read the expressions around the table, couldn't tell if he just saved his career or ended it. The Camden CEO studied the slide for what felt like an eternity, his weathered face giving away nothing. Then he smiled. Gentlemen, I think we found our strategy. The room erupted into discussion. Handshakes were exchanged, questions were asked, and details were negotiated. Jake stood at the front trying to process that he'd actually pulled it off, that Catherine's gamble on him had paid off. He caught her eye across the conference room and saw pride there, warm and unmistakable. Richard Blackwood watched the celebration with an expression that promised the war wasn't over, just this particular battle. After the clients left and the board dispersed, Jake was packing up his laptop when Richard cornered him by the elevators. The older man's smile had nothing friendly in it. Congratulations on the win, Morrison. Catherine's quite taken with you. It's a professional relationship. Richard laughed, the sound cold and calculating. Is it, I've been watching you two. The late nights, the coffee runs, the way she looks at you when she thinks no one's paying attention. Jake felt his face heat, anger and embarrassment burning through him in equal measure. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Catherine's position is precarious. The board is already skeptical of her leadership. They're looking for reasons to question her judgment, to prove she's not ready for the role her father gave her. Richard stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Your friendship gives them ammunition. CEO showing favoritism to subordinate. The optics are terrible. We haven't violated any policies. Policies don't matter when perception is reality. If you actually care about Catherine's career, you'll keep your distance. Because I promise you, Morrison, the board is watching. And they will act if given sufficient cause. Richard walked away, leaving Jake standing alone by the elevators with a sick feeling spreading through his stomach. The threat was clear and worse, it wasn't entirely wrong. Jake had felt the shift between himself and Catherine over the past 8 weeks, the way their working relationship had drifted into something more complicated. He'd been so focused on not acknowledging it that he hadn't considered how it might look to outside observers. That night after Harper was asleep, Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Richard's personal number. He stared at the screen, debating whether to ignore it. Curiosity won. Think about Harper. If Catherine loses her position, Reynolds Media Group destabilizes. Board purge follows. You'll be first out the door along with everyone else she hired. Can you afford to lose this job? Can your daughter Jake deleted the message, but couldn't delete the questions it raised? He had maybe 6 months of savings if he was careful. Medical bills from Sarah's treatment still drained his account every month. Finding another marketing director position in Boston's competitive market could take 3 to 6 months, maybe longer. And Harper needed stability, needed the routine that kept her nightmares at bay and her therapy sessions consistent. The company holiday party happened 2 weeks later, a mandatory celebration in the downtown ballroom Reynolds Media Group rented every November. Jake normally avoided these events, but Catherine had made attendance an explicit expectation for department heads. He'd planned to show his face for an hour, then escape home to Harper. Except Connor's kids came down with the flu that morning, eliminating his backup childcare option. Jake's parents were visiting his sister in California. The only choice was bringing Harper to the party or not going at all. He chose Harper. She wore her favorite purple dress and promised to be on her best behavior if he let her have dessert first. They arrived fashionably late to find the ballroom already packed with employees in various states of professional networking. Jake grabbed Harper's hand and started navigating toward the periphery, planning to find a quiet corner where his daughter could eat cake while he did the minimum required socializing. Catherine found them first. She moved through the crowd with the kind of presence that made people naturally create space, her emerald cocktail dress, a deliberate statement that she belonged in boardrooms and ballrooms equally. But when she spotted Harper, Catherine's executive armor cracked into something genuine. "Harper, I didn't know you'd be here." Harper's face lit up with an enthusiasm she rarely showed for adults who weren't family. She launched into an enthusiastic explanation of her latest art project, something involving glitter and construction paper, and what sounded like an alarming amount of glue. Catherine listened with the same focused attention she brought to board presentations, asking follow-up questions and genuinely engaging with 8-year-old logic. Jake watched his boss and his daughter interact and felt something dangerous settle in his chest, warm and terrifying, and impossible to ignore. Other employees noticed. Jake saw the glances, the subtle whispers, the way people's eyes tracked Catherine as she spent 20 minutes talking to Harper instead of networking with executives. Richard Blackwood stood across the ballroom, watching the scene with an expression that promised consequences. Eventually, Harper declared she was hungry enough to eat everything on the dessert table. Catherine laughed, and the sound was light and unguarded in a way Jake had never heard from her. She walked with them to the buffet, still listening to Harper's chatter about school and friends and the science fair project she was planning. The moment happened at the dessert table. Harper was debating between chocolate cake and cookies when she turned to Catherine with the kind of blunt honesty only children could deliver. "Daddy never comes to parties. He says they're boring." Catherine's eyes met Jake's over Harper's head, amusement dancing in their depths. "That's because he hasn't had the right company." The comment was light, probably meant as nothing more than playful banter, but it landed in Jake's chest like a grenade, detonating feelings he'd been carefully not examining for 8 weeks. He looked at Catherine Reynolds in her emerald dress with his daughter's hand in hers, and something clicked into place that he couldn't unclick. This was dangerous. This was complicated. This was everything Richard had warned him about, and everything Jake couldn't afford to want. And he wanted it anyway. They stayed at the party another hour, the three of them existing in a bubble that felt separate from the corporate networking happening around them. Harper eventually fell asleep against Catherine's shoulder the late hour, in full stomach, conspiring to overwhelm her determination to stay awake. Catherine held her carefully, one hand supporting Harper's head, while she continued talking to Jake about everything and nothing. Walking to their cars afterward felt significant in ways Jake couldn't articulate. Harper was awake again, holding both their hands and swinging between them like they were a family, instead of a boss and employee with complicated feelings neither could acknowledge. The November night was cold enough to see their breath, the first real hint that winter was coming, whether they were ready or not. At his car, Jake started to say thank you and goodbye, but Harper beat him to speaking. She looked up at Catherine with the kind of serious expression that meant she was about to ask something important. "Do you have kids?" Catherine knelt down to Harper's eye level, her designer dress touching the parking lot concrete without hesitation. "No, I don't." "Why not? Don't you like kids?" Jake started to intervene to apologize for his daughter's directness, but Catherine shook her head slightly. She considered Harper's question with the same thoughtfulness she brought to complex business problems. "I love kids. I just haven't found the right time or the right person to have them with yet." Harper processed this with 8-year-old logic, her face scrunched in concentration. Then she smiled, the kind of bright, uncomplicated smile that was becoming rarer as she got older. "I think you'd be a really good mom." Catherine's eyes went bright with tears she didn't let fall. She pulled Harper into a hug that lasted just long enough to be meaningful before standing and stepping back to safe professional distance. Her gaze met Jake's, and the vulnerability in her expression made his chest ache. "Thank you, Harper. That's one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me." On the drive home, Harper fell asleep in the back seat almost immediately. Jake drove through Boston's late-night traffic and tried not to think about Catherine's expression when Harper called her a good mom. Tried not to think about how right they'd look together. Tried not to think about the fact that his daughter had just given permission he hadn't known he was waiting for. At a red light, his phone buzzed with a text. Catherine's name appeared on the screen. "Thank you for tonight. Harper is wonderful. You're doing an amazing job with her." Jake stared at the message, watching the light turn green and back to red again, while the car behind him honked impatiently. He typed and deleted 4 different responses before settling on something simple and true. "Thank you for being kind to her. It means more than you know." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, her response came through. "She makes it easy. You both do." Jake didn't respond. He couldn't not without saying things that would cross lines he wasn't sure they should cross. He put the phone down and drove home, his mind replaying every moment of the evening and trying to convince himself that what he felt was manageable, controllable, something that would fade with time and professional distance. But when Harper woke up enough to stumble into the house, she said something that made Jake's careful denial impossible to maintain. "I like her, Daddy. She's not trying to be mommy. She's just Catherine. Can she be our friend?" Jake tucked his daughter into bed and sat in the darkness of her room long after she fell asleep, watching her breathe and trying to figure out how to answer a question that felt infinitely more complicated than Harper understood. Sarah's picture sat on Harper's nightstand, frozen in a moment of happiness from before the cancer stole everything. Jake picked it up, studying his late wife's smile and wondering what she would think of the mess he was making of moving forward. His phone buzzed one more time. Another text from Catherine sent 20 minutes ago while he'd been lost in thought. "For what it's worth, I'd like to be your friend too, both of you." Jake set down Sarah's picture and stared at Catherine's message until his vision blurred. Sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our greatest happiness, he thought. All it takes is courage to face them. The question was whether he had that kind of courage and what it would cost him if he tried to find out. Thanksgiving week arrived with the particular pressure that comes from holidays designed for families when your family has a Sarah-shaped hole in it. Jake had planned the usual quiet dinner with Harper, just the 2 of them, navigating gratitude while pretending the empty chair didn't matter. Then Catherine's invitation changed everything. The text came on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, direct and slightly hesitant in a way that felt uncharacteristic for someone who ran board meetings with absolute confidence. "What are you doing Thursday? I'm alone too. My father can't travel yet. Would you and Harper like to join me? Fair warning, I'm terrible at cooking, but excellent at ordering catering." Jake read the message 3 times, his thumb hovering over the keyboard, while his brain constructed and discarded a dozen different responses. Every instinct screamed that accepting was dangerous, that spending a major holiday with his boss crossed lines they'd been carefully pretending didn't exist. But Harper appeared over his shoulder before he could decide, reading the text with the kind of invasion of privacy 8-year-olds considered their birthright. "Can we go, Daddy? Please." Her eyes held an excitement he couldn't bring himself to extinguish. Harper had been asking about Catherine all week, wondering if they'd see her again, if she was really their friend now. Jake typed his acceptance before his common sense could override his daughter's hope. Catherine's penthouse occupied the top floor of a converted warehouse in the Seaport District, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor. The space was beautiful in that carefully curated way that suggested a professional decorator rather than personal accumulation. Minimalist furniture, strategic art pieces, and absolutely no evidence that anyone actually lived here rather than just used it as an expensive hotel room. Harper's immediate response upon entering was to ask if they were allowed to touch anything. Catherine laughed, the sound genuine and slightly nervous. "Everything except the vase by the window. My grandmother brought it from Italy. Other than that, consider this a no museum rules zone." The catered Thanksgiving spread covered Catherine's dining table in elegant abundance. Turkey and all the traditional sides presented with the kind of professional polish that came from expensive restaurants rather than home kitchens. Catherine had set 3 places with formal china that probably cost more than Jake's monthly mortgage payment. Dinner started awkward, all of them too aware they were playing at being a family when they were technically boss employee and accidental third party. Harper broke the tension by asking Catherine if rich people ate different food than regular people, a question so blunt it made Jake nearly choke on his water. Catherine considered the question seriously, treating Harper's curiosity with the same respect she'd shown during their previous encounters. I think we all eat pretty much the same things. Some people just pay more for someone else to cook it. That seems silly. It absolutely is, but I genuinely can't cook without setting off smoke alarms, so paying for help is basically a fire safety decision. Harper giggled, and the sound dissolved the remaining tension. Conversation flowed more naturally after that, meandering through safe topics until Harper asked about Catherine's childhood, with the innocent directness that made Jake simultaneously proud and mortified. Catherine's expression shifted, vulnerability flickering across her face before she could hide it behind professional composure. She set down her fork and seemed to be deciding how much truth an 8-year-old could handle. My mom died when I was 12. Car accident. After that, my dad threw himself into work because grief is hard and building a company is easier than feeling things. I got sent to boarding schools, which are basically fancy places where rich people's kids go when their parents don't know what to do with them. The admission hung in the air, honest and painful. Harper absorbed this information with the kind of thoughtful expression she wore when processing complex emotions in therapy. So you were alone? Most of the time, yes. Harper pushed green beans around her plate, her small face serious with consideration. Then she looked up at Catherine with those gray eyes that saw too much for someone so young. You're like Daddy and me. We're missing somebody too. Catherine's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached across the table to squeeze Harper's fingers. I've always wondered what a real family Thanksgiving would feel like. Thank you for being here. Jake felt something crack open in his chest, warm and terrifying, and impossible to contain. This wasn't just attraction anymore, wasn't just the surface-level pull of chemistry and proximity. This was deeper, more dangerous, the kind of connection that rewired your entire understanding of what possible futures might exist. After dinner, Harper insisted on watching the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade replay on Catherine's television, a tradition Sarah had loved that Jake had been maintaining through sheer force of will. Catherine settled onto her minimalist couch with Harper between them, and his daughter fell asleep within 20 minutes, her head tilted against Catherine's shoulder, with the absolute trust children reserve for people they've decided are safe. Catherine held very still, like she was afraid moving might break whatever spell had made Harper choose her as a temporary pillow. Her eyes met Jake's over his daughter's sleeping form, and the tenderness in her expression made his throat tight. She's beautiful, Catherine whispered, barely audible over the television commentary about balloon handlers and marching bands. Jake carefully extracted Harper from the couch and carried her to Catherine's guest bedroom, tucking her under a duvet that probably cost more than his entire bed set. When he returned to the living room, Catherine had moved to the windows, staring out at the harbor lights, with her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold, despite the apartment's perfect climate control. The moment felt significant, weighted with everything they'd been carefully not saying for months. Jake crossed the room slowly, giving himself time to reconsider, to remember all of Richard's warnings about perception and propriety and professional boundaries. He stopped beside her at the window. Their reflections overlapped in the glass ghost images superimposed on the Boston skyline. Thank you for today. Harper doesn't warm up to people easily, not since Sarah. But with you, it's like she's known you forever. Catherine turned to face him close enough that he could count the faint freckles on her nose that her makeup usually concealed. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, vulnerable in ways he'd never heard from the CEO who commanded boardrooms. Jake, I need to tell you something. I'm falling for you. For both of you. I know it's complicated and probably completely inappropriate, but... Her words died as Jake stepped closer, closing the distance between them until he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Every rational thought in his head screamed to stop, to step back, to maintain the careful distance that kept their relationship safely in the realm of professional friendship. Instead, he lifted one hand to her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with a gentleness that felt like permission and question combined. I've been falling for you since that first morning in your office when you didn't fire me and instead gave me the Camden account. Maybe even before that. Catherine's breath hitched. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly, like she was savoring a moment she'd been imagining, but never quite believed would happen. But I'm terrified, Jake continued, the words tumbling out in a rush of honesty he couldn't contain. What if this doesn't work? Harper's already attached to you. If we try and fail, she loses another important person. I can't do that to her. Catherine opened her eyes, and the determination in them was the same focus she brought to impossible business problems and skeptical boards. I can't promise we won't fail. Nobody can promise that, but I can promise I won't walk away easily, and I would never ever hurt Harper. She means too much to me. The space between them evaporated. Jake pulled Catherine close and kissed her with months of suppressed want and fear and hope pouring into the contact. She kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt like she was afraid he might disappear if she didn't hold tight enough. The kiss was gentle and desperate, and absolutely nothing like the careful distance they'd been maintaining. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Catherine rested her forehead against his. We have to be smart about this. Jake nodded, trying to force his brain to engage with practical concerns when all it wanted to do was memorize the way Catherine felt in his arms. Agreed. We take this slow. Tell no one at work yet, not until we're sure. And I need to talk to Harper properly, make absolutely certain she's okay with this. Catherine respected that without question. She stepped back, creating professional distance, while her eyes stayed warm with everything the space between them couldn't erase. Talk to her. Make sure she's ready. I'll wait. Jake left 20 minutes later with a sleeping Harper in his arms and Catherine's goodbye kiss still burning on his lips. The drive home felt surreal, like he was navigating familiar streets in an alternate universe where impossible things had suddenly become possible. December arrived with Boston's particular brand of cold that made the air feel sharp enough to cut. Jake spent the first week after Thanksgiving oscillating between exhilaration and absolute terror, replaying the kiss in Catherine's apartment, while simultaneously constructing disaster scenarios where everything fell apart spectacularly. Work became complicated in new ways. They maintained professional distance in the office, but the awareness crackled between them like static electricity. Every meeting felt charged, every accidental touch in the break room sent Jake's pulse racing. Jennifer Hayes started watching them with knowing amusement, though she had the discretion to keep her observations private. The office gossip mill noticed anyway. Whispers started circulating about the CEO and the marketing director's speculation, fueled by their frequent working lunches and the way Catherine's whole demeanor shifted when Jake entered a room. Jake heard fragments of conversation in bathroom stalls and break rooms, colleagues wondering if there was something happening or if they were imagining the tension. Richard Blackwood definitely noticed. Jake caught him watching during a presentation, his expression calculating in ways that promised nothing good. Harper's therapy appointment the second week of December brought everything into sharper focus. Dr. Evelyn Sinclair had been working with Harper for 18 months, helping her process grief and anxiety with the kind of patient expertise that made Jake grateful for insurance coverage and regular paychecks. The sessions usually happened without parental involvement, but Dr. Sinclair requested Jake join them for the last 10 minutes that Thursday. Harper sat in the child-size armchair that dominated Dr. Sinclair's office, swinging her legs and looking pleased with herself. The therapist smiled at Jake with the kind of expression that suggested good news. Harper had some interesting things to share today. I thought you should hear them directly. His daughter took the invitation seriously, her face scrunching with concentration as she organized her thoughts. Dr. Sinclair asked about Thanksgiving. I told her about Catherine and Eddie and how Daddy smiles different now when he talks about her. Jake's heart rate spiked. He'd been planning to have the conversation with Harper this weekend, but apparently his 88-year-old had beaten him to analysis. How do you feel about that? Dr. Sinclair asked gently, her attention focused entirely on Harper. I miss Mommy a lot, but Daddy's been sad for so long and I want him to be happy. Is that bad? The question came out small and uncertain, like Harper had been carrying the weight of it for weeks without knowing who to ask. Dr. Sinclair leaned forward, her voice warm with reassurance. It's not bad at all, Harper. You can love your mommy and still want your daddy to find happiness. Those two things don't cancel each other out. Your heart is big enough to hold both. Harper processed this with visible relief, her shoulders relaxing from tension Jake hadn't realized she'd been carrying. On the drive home, she chattered about school and friends and the science fair project she was planning with the kind of lightness that had been missing from her voice for months. That evening, after homework and dinner and the carefully maintained routines that structured their lives, Jake sat on the edge of Harper's bed for their usual goodnight ritual. Instead of reaching for her favorite book, she looked up at him with Sarah's directness. You like Catherine like her, don't you? The question shouldn't have surprised him. Harper had inherited her mother's ability to cut through pretense and land directly on uncomfortable truths. How did you know? Daddy, I'm 8, not stupid. You smile when she texts. You look at her the way you looked at mommy in the photos. Jake sat beside her, his heart racing with the weight of having a conversation he'd been rehearsing mentally for days. How would you feel if Catherine and I dated if she became more than just a friend? Harper was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she surprised him completely. Do you still love mommy? The question hit harder than Jake expected, tears burning his eyes without permission. He pulled Harper into his lap, holding her close, while trying to find words that were honest without being overwhelming. Every single day, always will. But your mom would want me to be happy. She wouldn't want me to be alone forever. Harper nodded against his chest, her voice muffled but clear. Dr. Sinclair says you can love new people and still love people who are gone. So I think mommy would be okay with it. And I think Catherine makes you happy. She makes me happy too. Relief and gratitude crashed over Jake in equal waves. He kissed the top of Harper's head, amazed by his daughter's resilience and wisdom. So you'd be okay if Catherine and I tried being more than friends. Can I still talk about mommy with her? Always. And Catherine knows she's not replacing your mom. Nobody could ever do that. Harper hugged him tighter. Okay, Daddy, you can have a girlfriend. The simplicity of her acceptance made Jake laugh through the tears he'd been trying to hold back. His 8-year-old daughter had just given permission he hadn't fully realized he'd been waiting for. He texted Catherine after Harper fell asleep, his hands shaking slightly as he typed. Had the conversation with Harper. She's okay with us. More than okay, actually. 3 dots appeared immediately, like Catherine had been waiting for his message. Really, she's sure as an 8-year-old can be about anything. She says you make me smile different. I want to make you smile all kinds of different. Can I see you this weekend? Jake stared at the message, his heart doing complicated things in his chest. This was happening. They were actually doing this. Harper wants to invite you to help us decorate our Christmas tree Saturday. Fair warning, there will be excessive amounts of glitter. I wouldn't miss it for anything. The third week of December brought the kind of cold that made Boston feel actively hostile to human survival. Catherine arrived at Jake's modest colonial house in jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking nothing like the CEO who commanded boardrooms, and everything like someone Jake could build a life with. Harper greeted her at the door with an enthusiasm that bordered on tackle-hugging, dragging Catherine inside to see the artificial tree Jake had wrestled into position that morning. The house was warm with the smell of sugar cookies baking and Christmas music playing from speakers that had been Sarah's back when their lives included room for seasonal traditions. Catherine had brought ornaments, carefully wrapped packages that Harper unwrapped with reverent excitement. Glass snowflakes and delicate icicles, the kind of elegant decorations that belonged in magazine spreads, rather than on a tree that would inevitably get covered in Harper's handmade creations and kindergarten craft projects. But the gift that made Harper cry happy tears was a handmade ornament Catherine had clearly spent time creating. A small wooden disc painted white with "Best Friend Catherine" written in careful script. Harper had made dozens of these over the years, gifting them to teachers and grandparents, and occasionally her father. Seeing one made for Catherine in Catherine's handwriting felt like acceptance and belonging wrapped in painted wood. They decorated for 3 hours, Harper directing traffic with the authority of someone who took Christmas very seriously. Catherine followed instructions without question, hanging ornaments where Harper pointed and listening to the 8-year-old's stories behind each decoration with genuine interest. Jake watched his daughter and the woman he was falling for create traditions in real time and felt his careful emotional defenses crumbling completely. Harper fell asleep on the couch during the elf wedged between Jake and Catherine with the absolute contentment of children who feel completely safe. Catherine held very still, one hand gently stroking Harper's hair with a tenderness that made Jake's throat tight. He carefully carried Harper to bed, tucking her in and whispering good night to a daughter who was already too deeply asleep to hear him. When he returned to the living room, Catherine was standing by the Christmas tree, studying the collection of ornaments like they held secrets worth discovering. Jake crossed the room and stood behind her, close enough to feel her warmth, but not quite touching. The lights from the tree cast colored shadows across her face. "Thank you for today, for being so good with her." Catherine turned, and the vulnerability in her expression was raw and honest and absolutely devastating. "Jake, I need you to understand something. I'm not just falling for you. I'm falling for both of you for this whole package deal. And that terrifies me because I've never wanted something this much in my entire life." Jake closed the remaining distance between them and kissed her like his life depended on it, pouring months of want and fear and hope into the contact. Catherine responded with equal desperation, her hands tangling in his hair, while he pulled her closer, closer, trying to eliminate any space between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Catherine rested her forehead against his chest. "We should probably talk about logistics, about what this means for work." Jake nodded, forcing his brain to engage with practical concerns when all it wanted was to keep kissing her until the world made sense again. "We need to be smart, take things slow, keep work and personal separate until we know this is real." "Except I already know it's real," Catherine whispered, her voice certain in ways that made Jake's heart race. "I knew it the morning you walked out of my office after I didn't fire you. I just didn't let myself admit it until now." They stayed on Jake's couch until past midnight, talking through logistics and boundaries and all the complicated realities of dating your boss when you have a daughter who's already emotionally invested. Catherine would file the appropriate disclosure with HR after the holidays. They'd be transparent about their relationship, but without making it public knowledge. Work meetings would stay professional. Personal time would be sacred. The rules felt necessary and insufficient, in equal measure a framework for navigating territory neither of them had mapped before. Catherine left close to 1 in the morning, her goodbye kiss lasting long enough to make Jake reconsider every boundary they'd just established. He watched her drive away and then stood in his driveway, staring at the stars, wondering how his life had gone from grief-stricken survival to this kind of possibility in less than 4 months. The answer came in the form of a mistaken text message and a CEO who'd chosen mercy over policy. Sometimes the universe's biggest mistakes led to its greatest gifts. January arrived with the particular cruelty of New England winter temperatures dropping below zero and snow accumulating in dirty piles that would last until March. The 15th loomed on Jake's calendar, with the weight it always carried, a date circled in his mind, even when it wasn't marked on any physical surface. 3 years since Sarah died. 3 years since Harper lost her mother and Jake lost his wife, and their entire world rearranged itself around an absence that never stopped aching. Catherine noticed his mood shift in the days leading up to the anniversary. Jake became quieter, more withdrawn, the grief he usually kept carefully managed, breaking through his defenses. She gave him space but checked in regularly, text messages that said, "I'm here," without demanding explanations he didn't have energy to give. 2 days before the anniversary, she asked him directly, "What do you usually do on the 15th?" They were in Jake's office, technically reviewing quarterly projections, but actually just existing in the same space, while Jake tried to pretend he was functional. He set down the spreadsheet he'd been staring at without actually reading. "Harper and I visit Sarah's grave. Bring flowers. Tell her about our year. It sounds morbid, but it helps Em feel connected to her mother." Catherine absorbed this without judgment, her expression thoughtful. "Would it be okay if I came to pay my respects?" Jake looked up sharply, surprised by the offer. "You'd do that?" "Of course, she was important to you and Harper. That makes her important to me." The simple logic of it made Jake's eyes burn with tears he didn't have the energy to hide. Catherine's willingness to honor Sarah's memory, instead of being threatened by it, felt like grace he didn't deserve but desperately needed. January 15th dawned cold and clear, the kind of winter morning where the sun felt decorative rather than functional. Jake picked up Catherine before driving to Riverside Cemetery, Harper unusually quiet in the back seat. His daughter always got withdrawn around the anniversary, processing grief in ways that broke Jake's heart because he couldn't fix them. Sarah's headstone was simple granite with her name dates and the phrase beloved wife and mother that felt simultaneously true and inadequate. Jake had chosen it in the numb haze of funeral planning when every decision felt impossible and nothing felt real. Harper placed fresh daisies at the base of the stone, then settled cross-legged in the frozen grass like she was visiting a friend rather than a grave. Her voice came out small but steady. "Hi, Mommy. I'm doing good in school. Got an A on my science project about volcanoes. Daddy helped, but I did most of it myself." Jake added his own flowers, yellow roses that had been Sarah's favorite. His throat felt too tight for words, but he forced them out anyway. "We miss you, Sarah. Every day. I hope you know I'm trying my best with Em. Some days are harder than others, but we're figuring it out." Catherine had stayed back near the car, giving them privacy for their ritual. But Harper turned and waved her forward with the kind of confidence that came from Dr. Sinclair's months of therapy about healthy grief processing. "Catherine, come here." Catherine approached slowly, her expression respectful and slightly uncertain. She knelt beside Harper in the snow-dusted grass, her expensive coat touching the ground without hesitation. Harper took her hand. "Mommy, this is Catherine. She's really nice to Daddy and me. She helps take care of Daddy when he works too much." The simple introduction made Jake's vision blur with tears. Catherine's voice came out thick with emotion when she spoke, addressing the headstone with the same seriousness she brought to board presentations. "Mrs. Morrison, I promise to honor your memory. Harper talks about you all the time. You raised an incredible daughter, and I'll do everything I can to help Jake take care of her." Something broke open in Jake's chest, grief and gratitude and hope mixing together until he couldn't tell where one emotion ended and another began. He sank down beside Catherine in the frozen grass and let himself cry, really cry, for the first time in months. Catherine's arm came around his shoulders while Harper pressed against his other side, the three of them kneeling at Sarah's grave in a moment that felt like permission and blessing combined. The healing Jake had been seeking for 3 years didn't magically appear. Grief didn't work that way, didn't follow timelines or respond to wishes. But something shifted anyway, a recognition that moving forward didn't mean forgetting, that new love didn't erase old love, that his heart was actually big enough to hold both. That night, after Harper was asleep and Catherine had gone home, Jake's phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number. He almost deleted it without listening, assuming spam or wrong number. Curiosity won. Richard Blackwood's voice filled his ear, smooth and threatening in equal measure. "Morrison, we need to talk about your relationship with Catherine. Call me. For her sake." The message ended abruptly, leaving Jake staring at his phone with dread pooling in his stomach. He'd known Richard wouldn't ignore their relationship indefinitely. The COO had been watching too closely, waiting for ammunition. Jake called back despite every instinct screaming to ignore the summons. Richard answered on the second ring like he'd been expecting the response. "Coffee tomorrow. Neutral ground. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." They met at a cafe equidistant from both their homes, neither willing to give the other home field advantage. Richard arrived first, already seated with an espresso and an expression that promised nothing good. Jake sat across from him, tension coiling in his shoulders. Richard didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've known Catherine since she was a child. I care about her future even if she doesn't believe that." "Then why are you constantly undermining her?" Richard's smile held no warmth. "I'm protecting this company from poor decisions made by someone too young and inexperienced to understand the consequences. The board is already skeptical of her leadership. Your relationship gives them exactly the ammunition they need. We've disclosed properly to HR. We're not violating any policies. Policies don't matter when perception is reality. Dating subordinate creates terrible optics regardless of protocol. If you actually care about Catherine's career, you'll end this before it destroys everything she's worked for." Jake felt his jaw clench, anger mixing with the sick knowledge that Richard wasn't entirely wrong. The board had been looking for reasons to question Catherine's judgment since day one. A relationship with someone she'd personally promoted could be exactly the excuse they needed. "This sounds less like concern for Catherine and more like you looking for ways to push her out." Richard's mask slipped, revealing the bitterness underneath. "She's not ready for this role. Too impulsive, too emotional. Just like her mother." The venom in his voice when mentioning Catherine's mother sent warning bells clanging in Jake's head. This wasn't professional rivalry. This was personal, rooted in something that went back decades. What happened between you and Catherine's mother? Richard's expression shuddered immediately. That's none of your business. What is your business is understanding that the board will act if given sufficient cause. You're that cause, Morrison. The question is whether you care enough about Catherine to remove yourself from the equation. Jake left the cafe with Richard's words echoing in his head and doubt churning in his stomach. That evening after Harper was in bed, he told Catherine everything. She listened without interrupting, her face growing progressively paler as Jake recounted the conversation. When he finished, Catherine stood and paced her apartment, arms wrapped around herself. Richard and my mother had an affair 20 years ago before I was born. My father found out, ended their friendship. After Mom died, Dad eventually forgave him and brought him back into the company. But Richard never forgave Dad for choosing family over him. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Richard's resentment wasn't about Catherine's capabilities. It was about her existence, the living reminder that Robert Reynolds had chosen his wife and daughter over Richard Blackwood's ambitions. Catherine turned to face Jake, her expression determined despite the fear in her eyes. I won't let him use you against me. We need to be public, transparent. File official disclosure with HR, follow every protocol perfectly. Take away his ability to expose us. But won't that give the board ammunition? It takes away their ability to claim we were hiding something. We control the narrative instead of letting Richard control it for us. Jake crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, feeling her trembling against him. Are you sure? Catherine's voice came out muffled against his chest, but absolutely certain. I'm sure about you, about us. The rest we'll figure out. They filed the official relationship disclosure with HR on a Monday morning, the paperwork formal and clinical, in its reduction of something profound to checkbox compliance. Jennifer Hayes delivered the forms to HR personally, her expression neutral, but her eyes holding a warmth that suggested approval. The bomb had been set, now they waited to see who would be caught in the blast. February brought the Hartman Pharmaceuticals opportunity, a major account that could secure Catherine's position for years or provide Richard with the perfect weapon to destroy her. The client was old money Boston conservative in their business dealings and skeptical of Reynolds Media Group's recent leadership changes. Richard supported Jake's assignment to the account with suspicious enthusiasm, which should have been Jake's first warning. Instead, he threw himself into the work with the same intensity he'd brought to Camden, determined to prove that Catherine's faith in him wasn't misplaced. The presentation day arrived with the particular tension that comes from knowing everything is riding on one pitch. The full board attended, along with Hartman's executive team and enough vice presidents to make the conference room feel crowded. Richard sat in the front row with the satisfied expression of someone who'd already won a game, everyone else was still playing. Jake's presentation was solid, built on weeks of research and strategic planning. He walked through comprehensive digital strategies, targeted campaigns, and data-driven projections with the confidence that came from knowing his material inside and out. The Hartman team leaned forward, engaged and asking good questions. Halfway through the Q&A session, Richard raised his hand. Before we proceed, I feel obligated to disclose something relevant to this discussion. Jake Morrison is in a romantic relationship with our CEO, Catherine Reynolds. They've filed the appropriate paperwork, but I think our potential clients deserve to know they're evaluating work that was assigned under circumstances that could suggest favoritism. The room went silent. Every eye swiveled between Jake, Catherine, and Richard. The insinuation hung in the air, poison disguised as transparency. Jake felt his face flush with anger and humiliation. Hartman's CEO frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this had taken. Is this true? Catherine stood before Jake could respond, her voice cool and professional, despite the fury Jake could see simmering beneath her composed exterior. Yes, Mr. Morrison and I are in a relationship properly disclosed per company policy, but he was assigned the Hartman account based purely on merit. His Camden magazine relaunch increased readership by 41% and brought in 3 major advertisers. His track record speaks for itself. Richard leaned back in his chair, playing the concerned colleague perfectly. With respect, Catherine, optics matter in business. How can clients trust our objectivity when personal relationships influence professional decisions? Jake stood, anger overriding his better judgment. Every carefully maintained boundary evaporated in the face of Richard's calculated attack. "You're right, Mr. Blackwood. Optics matter." He pulled out a portfolio he'd prepared for exactly this scenario, distributing copies to each board member and the Hartman team. "Here's my work from my previous agency. 4 major accounts won in 18 months, all documented with results and client testimonials. Every campaign predates my employment at Reynolds Media Group, let alone any relationship with Ms. Reynolds." Jake turned to address the Hartman CEO directly, his voice steady despite his racing pulse. "Judge my pitch on its strategic merit. If you think it's good because of who I'm dating, rather than the quality of the work, we don't deserve your business. But I'd ask you to consider whether you're letting internal politics cloud your evaluation of objective results." The room held its collective breath. Hartman's executive team conferred in hushed voices, while the board watched with varying expressions of discomfort and calculation. Richard's satisfied smile had slipped into something more uncertain. Finally, Hartman's CEO spoke, his weathered face thoughtful. "Mr. Morrison, your strategy is innovative and well-researched. Mr. Blackwood raises valid concerns about perception. However, I've built my company on recognizing talent, regardless of where I find it or who knows them. Your Camden numbers are verifiable and impressive. Let's discuss contract terms." Relief and vindication crashed over Jake in equal waves. They'd won the account, but Richard's attack had landed anyway. Every board member's expression made clear they'd be discussing Catherine's judgment at their next private meeting. After the clients left and the board dispersed, Jake found Catherine in her office staring out at Boston Harbor with rigid shoulders that betrayed the stress she was hiding. He closed the door and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms without asking permission. "I'm sorry, I should have seen Richard's play coming." Catherine turned in his embrace, her eyes fierce despite the fear underneath. "You saved the pitch, defended both of us without making it worse. That took courage. But the board was always going to question me. That's Richard's long game. At least now we're not hiding." Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see Richard's name on the screen, a text message that made his blood run cold. "Congratulations on Hartman. Emergency board meeting next Thursday. Catherine's leadership will be formally challenged. Hope your relationship was worth her career." He showed Catherine the message. Her face went pale, but her voice stayed steady. "Then we prepare. I've increased profits by 34% in 9 months. I've won 3 major accounts. The numbers are on my side." And if the numbers aren't enough, Catherine pulled Jake down for a kiss that tasted like desperation and determination in equal measure. "Then we fight anyway. Because some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are bad." That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, while his mind constructed disaster scenarios. Catherine losing her position, the company destabilizing and the resulting chaos, board purges that would eliminate everyone she'd hired, including him, unemployment with medical bills still piling up, and Harper needing stability he couldn't provide. Connor's voice echoed in his memory. "You honor Sarah by being a good father and a good man, but being a good father meant protecting Harper's future, and being a good man meant not destroying Catherine's career for a relationship that was barely 2 months old." Jake's phone buzzed with another text from Richard, sent at 2 in the morning, like the man knew sleep would be impossible. "Still time to do the right thing. End it cleanly. Save her career. Think about what matters." Jake deleted the message, but couldn't delete the questions it raised. What did matter, love or security? The chance at happiness or the certainty of survival? Catherine's dreams or Harper's stability? The answer should have been simple. Instead, Jake watched dawn break over Boston and wondered if doing the right thing would require breaking his own heart before someone else did it for him. Jake spent the night after Richard's threat constructing and discarding plans, each one collapsing under the weight of variables he couldn't control. By dawn, exhaustion had burned through his anxiety enough to leave only clarity. He couldn't protect Catherine by walking away. He could only protect her by fighting back. He called Connor at 6 in the morning, knowing his best friend would be awake dealing with his own children's chaotic breakfast routines. Connor answered over the sound of cereal bowls clattering and siblings arguing about cartoon choices. "Please tell me you're calling with good news. I need help. Something's wrong with Richard Blackwood, and I need to prove it before he destroys Catherine's career." The background noise on Connor's end diminished as he apparently moved to a quieter room. His voice came back serious, stripped of its usual humor. What kind of help? You still talk to that forensic accountant who handled your divorce discovery. Connor was quiet for a beat, processing the implications. Marcus Webb. Yeah, we grab drinks occasionally. What are you thinking? Jake explained his suspicions, the feeling that Richard's confidence came from having cards nobody else could see. The way he'd undermined Catherine systematically for 9 months, always staying just within the bounds of plausible professional disagreement. The venom in his voice when mentioning Catherine's mother, suggesting wounds that went deeper than failed business or relationships. I think Richard's been sabotaging deals. Maybe worse. But I need proof, and I need someone who knows how to find financial irregularities that are meant to stay hidden. Connor agreed without hesitation, the loyalty of 20 years of friendship overriding any concerns about getting involved in corporate warfare. They arranged to meet that evening after Harper was asleep, Connor promising to bring Marcus Webb if the accountant was willing. Jake spent the day at Webb in a fog of distraction, reviewing the same reports 3 times without absorbing their content. Catherine noticed during their afternoon check-in, concern etching lines around her eyes. You look exhausted. Did you sleep at all? Not really, too busy thinking about Thursday. She crossed her office and pulled him into an embrace that felt like the only solid thing in a tilting world. Her voice came out muffled against his shoulder. We'll figure this out. Richard's been planning this for months. We just need to be smarter. Or we need to find out what he's really hiding. Catherine pulled back, studying his face. What are you planning? Insurance, I'll tell you if it pans out. That evening, Connor arrived with Marcus Webb, a wiry man in his 50s, whose unremarkable appearance disguised the kind of ruthless, analytical mind that made him excellent at finding money people wanted to keep hidden. They spread out at Jake's kitchen table with laptops and coffee while Harper did homework upstairs. Marcus listened to Jake's theories without interrupting, his expression neutral. When Jake finished, the accountant leaned back and steepled his fingers. You're asking me to dig into a COO's financial history looking for fraud. That's not casual favor territory. That's potential criminal investigation territory. I know, but something's there. Richard's too confident, like he knows the board will vote his way regardless of Catherine's performance numbers. That kind of certainty comes from leverage we don't see. Marcus exchanged a look with Connor, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, he nodded. I'll do preliminary digging. Public records, only nothing that crosses legal lines. If I find anomalies worth investigating further, we go to proper authorities. They worked until past midnight, Marcus navigating databases and corporate filings, while Jake and Connor provided context about Reynolds Media Group's structure and history. The accountant's expression grew increasingly thoughtful as patterns emerged from the data. There are irregularities here. 20 years ago, significant funds went missing from several accounts. An investigation was opened, then abruptly closed after he checked his notes. After Catherine's mother died, the timing's suspicious. Jake's stomach dropped. Catherine had mentioned her mother died in a car accident when she was 12. If Richard had been involved somehow, if the affair Catherine mentioned had gone deeper than she knew, can you prove connection between Richard and the missing funds? Marcus shook his head. Not from public records, but I can show you enough to justify bringing in authorities who have subpoena power. The question is whether you want to open that door. What door? Catherine's voice came from the doorway, making all 3 men jump. She stood in Jake's entryway, still wearing her work clothes, having apparently let herself in with the key Jake had given her 2 weeks ago. Her expression was carefully neutral, but fear lurked in her eyes. Jake introduced Marcus quickly, then laid out what they'd found. Catherine listened without interrupting, her face growing progressively paler. When they finished, she sank into the chair beside Jake. My mother was going to meet someone the night she died. The police never found out who. They ruled it an accident, single-car collision, poor weather conditions. But what if... She couldn't finish the sentence. Jake took her hand, feeling it tremble in his grip. Marcus cleared his throat gently. If you want to pursue this, I know investigators who specialize in cold cases involving financial crime. But Ms. Reynolds, I need you to understand, if we open this investigation, we might uncover things that are painful regardless of whether Richard was involved. Catherine straightened her shoulders, determination replacing shock on her face. Do it. Whatever the truth is, I need to know. The investigation moved faster than Jake expected. Marcus connected them with a private investigator named Sarah Chen, no relation to his late wife, though the name made Jake's chest tight anyway. She'd worked financial fraud cases for the FBI before going private, and she approached the Reynolds case with methodical intensity. 3 days before the board meeting, she called Jake with news. He was at his desk pretending to work on quarterly projections when his phone buzzed. "I found something. Can you meet?" They gathered in a conference room at the investigator's office, Catherine taking emergency time away from work. Sarah Chen spread documents across the table with the precision of someone building an airtight case. Richard Blackwood and Catherine's mother, Elizabeth Reynolds, were having an affair 20 years ago. That part you knew. What you didn't know is they were embezzling together, siphoning funds through shell companies. Elizabeth kept meticulous records. I found them in storage units she'd rented under a maiden name. Catherine's hand found Jake's under the table, gripping tight enough to hurt. Sarah continued, her voice professionally gentle, despite the bombshell she was delivering. "Elizabeth's assistant from that period is still alive. I tracked her down in Florida. She was willing to talk once I explained the context." According to her testimony, Elizabeth planned to confess everything to Robert Reynolds 2 days before her death. She was going to implicate Richard in exchange for leniency. The words hung in the air, their implications too terrible to speak aloud. Catherine's face had gone white, but her voice stayed steady. "You're saying Richard killed my mother. I'm saying the evidence suggests he had motive and opportunity, and that the accident investigation was suspiciously brief. Whether we can prove murder versus manslaughter versus actual accident is a question for prosecutors. But I have enough to bring to the authorities." Jake felt Catherine trembling beside him, her composure cracking. He pulled her close, letting her bury her face against his shoulder while Sarah Chen tactfully looked away. That evening brought another break. Hartman Pharmaceuticals CEO called Jake directly, his voice grave. "Mr. Morrison, something's come to our attention that I thought you should know. We've been experiencing information leaks about our marketing strategy, details only your team should have known. Our IT department traced the source to an IP address registered to Richard Blackwood." Jake's pulse spiked. "He's been leaking our proprietary work." "Appears so. Sent our strategy to 3 of our competitors, presumably hoping we'd blame your team and cancel the contract. We wanted you to know before taking this to your board." Jake thanked him and immediately called Catherine. She answered on the first ring, her voice raw from crying but functional. "Hartman has evidence Richard's been sabotaging us. IP addresses, leaked documents, everything. Combined with Sarah's findings about the embezzlement, we have him." Catherine's voice shifted into something harder, the CEO who commanded boardrooms, emerging from grief's fog. "Richard spent 9 months trying to destroy me. Now we destroy him first." The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 10 Thursday morning in Reynolds Media Group's largest conference room. Jake wasn't supposed to attend. He wasn't a board member, just the marketing director who'd become the center of Richard's manufactured scandal. But he positioned himself outside the room anyway, waiting for the right moment. Through the glass walls, he watched the board assemble. 12 mostly old men who'd built their careers alongside Robert Reynolds, now trying to decide if his daughter deserved the empire she'd inherited. Richard sat at the head of the table opposite Catherine, confidence radiating from his posture. The meeting started exactly on time. Richard wasted no breath on pleasantries, launching immediately into his case against Catherine's leadership. Too young, too inexperienced, risky decisions that prioritized innovation over stability. The inappropriate relationship with a subordinate that demonstrated poor judgment and created liability. Catherine defended herself with data and results. Revenue up 34% in 9 months. 3 major accounts won. Digital transformation ahead of industry trends. Every metric showing growth and improvement under her leadership. But Richard had prepared for her counter-arguments. He pulled out financial projections showing the growth was unsustainable, that the Camden and Hartman accounts had required concessions that would hurt long-term profitability. He questioned whether the numbers were even accurate, given Catherine's relationship with the person responsible for the campaigns. The insinuation landed like he'd intended. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that suggested Richard's poison was working. Jake watched Catherine's face through the glass, saw the moment she realized Richard had outmaneuvered her. The board wouldn't vote on merit or results. They'd vote on perception, on comfort, on their preference for familiar leadership over uncomfortable change. Richard called for the vote with barely concealed triumph. I move for a vote of no confidence in Catherine Reynolds' leadership, to be followed by her resignation as CEO. That's when Jake knocked on the conference room door and walked in without waiting for permission. Every head swiveled toward him, confusion and irritation mixing in their expressions. Richard's face went from triumph to fury in the space between heartbeats. This is a closed board meeting, Morrison. You have no standing here. Jake ignored him, walking directly to the chairman of the board and handing over a thick folder. His voice came out steadier than he felt. I'm here representing Hartman Pharmaceuticals. They asked me to deliver this personally. The chairman opened the folder while Richard's confident expression developed cracks. Inside were printouts of leaked emails, IP address traces, and a formal statement from Hartman's legal team documenting Richard's attempts to sabotage the account by feeding proprietary information to competitors. But Jake wasn't finished. He pulled out a second folder and placed it in front of the chairman. This is from a private investigation commissioned by Ms. Reynolds into financial irregularities from 20 years ago. You'll find evidence of systematic embezzlement by Richard Blackwood and Elizabeth Reynolds, along with testimony suggesting Elizabeth planned to confess before her death. The room erupted into chaos. Board members grabbed for the folders, their faces shifting from confusion to shock to horror as they processed the evidence. Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. This is fabricated nonsense, a desperate attempt to deflect from Catherine's incompetence. Jake met his eyes without flinching. Hartman hired independent investigators. They verified everything. Their lawyers are prepared to testify. The chairman looked up from the documents, his weathered face grave. Richard, is any of this true? For a moment, Richard's mask held. Then something broke behind his eyes, 20 years of resentment and bitterness flooding to the surface. His voice came out strangled with rage. I gave 30 years to this company. Robert promised me I'd take over when he retired. Then he chose his daughter instead, just like he chose his wife over me 20 years ago. The confession hung in the air, damning in its honesty. Several board members pulled out phones, presumably calling legal counsel. Catherine sat frozen, staring at the man who'd been part of her life since childhood. Richard wasn't finished. The dam had broken, and everything he'd kept hidden poured out in a torrent of self-justification. Elizabeth and I were building something together, a partnership, a future. Then she got scared, wanted to confess, threatened to implicate me to save herself. I couldn't let her destroy everything we'd worked for. The implication was clear. Catherine's face went from white to gray, and Jake moved to stand beside her, one hand on her shoulder in silent support. She was going to meet you the night she died. Catherine's voice came out barely above a whisper. You killed my mother. I made sure she couldn't ruin both our lives. If Robert had been less forgiving, if he hadn't brought me back into the company, none of this would have been necessary. But he always chose you people over me. His wife, his daughter, his legacy, like I was nothing. The chairman had already called security. Police arrived within minutes, having been discreetly positioned nearby on Sarah Chen's advice. They took Richard into custody while he alternated between defiance and breakdown, his careful facade completely shattered. The board sat in stunned silence as officers led their COO away. Catherine remained frozen in her chair, processing revelations that had rewritten her entire childhood. Her mother hadn't died in a simple accident. She'd been murdered by a man Catherine had known and trusted her whole life. Jake pulled her to her feet and guided her out of the conference room, away from the board members' shocked stares and stammered apologies. They ended up in her office, Catherine collapsing onto her couch while tremors racked her body. He held her while she cried, great shaking sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside. All the grief she'd carried for 20 years had been contaminated by betrayal, the loss of her mother now tangled with the knowledge that it had been preventable, that Richard had chosen murder over consequences. I trusted him, she finally managed, her voice hoarse. He was at my birthday parties. He taught me to ride a bike. He was supposed to be family. I know, I'm so sorry. They stayed in her office until the sun set over Boston Harbor. Catherine's tears had eventually subsiding into exhausted silence. Jennifer knocked softly around 6, her expression sympathetic. The board wants you to know they're tabling the vote of no confidence indefinitely. Several members have expressed their intention to issue formal apologies. Catherine nodded without speaking. Jake thanked Jennifer and sent her home, then called his parents to pick up Harper from school and keep her overnight. His daughter needed explanations he didn't have energy to provide yet. The weeks following Richard's arrest blurred together in a haze of police interviews, lawyer consultations, and media frenzy. The story was too salacious for Boston's business press, up to ignore COO arrested for 20-year-old murder embezzlement scandal corporate intrigue. Reynolds Media Group's stock actually rose on the news investors apparently appreciating the cleaning out of corruption. Catherine handled the crisis with remarkable composure, publicly giving carefully crafted statements and cooperating fully with authorities. Privately, she fell apart in Jake's arms most nights, processing grief that had been reopened and poisoned by truth. Harper struggled with the chaos differently. She knew something bad had happened, but couldn't quite grasp the adult complexities of murder and corporate betrayal. Dr. Sinclair helped her process the changes in their routine, the fact that Catherine now stayed over most nights because being alone made her shake. March brought the first signs of healing. Catherine started sleeping through the night without nightmares. She laughed at Harper's jokes again. The haunted look in her eyes didn't disappear, but it receded enough that Jake could see the woman he loved underneath the trauma. The board formally apologized and issued a unanimous vote of confidence in Catherine's leadership. She implemented sweeping ethics reforms, created independent oversight committees, and brought in external auditors to verify every financial process. Reynolds Media Group emerged from the scandal stronger and more transparent than it had been in decades. Jake got promoted to vice president of marketing, a decision vetted by external consultants to avoid any appearance of favoritism. The irony wasn't lost on him. Richard's attempt to destroy them had resulted in both their careers flourishing. But the real healing happened in smaller moments. Catherine joining them for dinner most nights, her presence becoming part of Harper's routine. Movie nights on the couch with Harper wedged between them. Catherine helping with homework while Jake cooked. The three of them building something that looked increasingly like a family. April brought Harper's 9th birthday, a milestone that felt significant for reasons Jake couldn't quite articulate. They threw a party at his house, Harper's entire class descending in a chaos of games and cake and presents. Catherine moved through the celebration like she belonged there, comfortable with the controlled chaos in ways that made Jake's chest tight. After the guests left and Harper crashed from sugar overload, Catherine and Jake cleaned up the debris of successful celebration. She was scraping frosting off plates when she asked the question that had been hovering unspoken for weeks. "Do you think Harper's really okay with us?" Jake set down the trash bag he was filling and pulled Catherine close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with birthday cake. "I think she adores you. I think you make her feel safe. And I think Sarah would approve." "How can you know that?" "Because I know Sarah, and because she left something for you." He'd been waiting for the right moment to share Sarah's letter, the sealed envelope he'd found in her personal effects with instructions about when to open it. Jake retrieved it from his bedroom, while Catherine waited with visible anxiety. The envelope was addressed in Sarah's handwriting for whoever Jake loves next. Catherine's hands shook as she opened it, her eyes filling with tears before she finished the first paragraph. Sarah's words were characteristically direct and generous, giving permission Catherine didn't know she needed. The letter acknowledged the strangeness of writing to someone she'd never meet, then laid out everything she wanted for Jake and Harper after she was gone. Someone kind. Someone who would love Harper as fiercely as Sarah had. Someone who understood that new love didn't erase old love, just added to it. The postscript made Catherine laugh through her tears. P.S. Jake's favorite flowers are actually daisies, not roses. Don't tell him I told you. They sat on Jake's couch, reading and rereading Sarah's blessing until Harper appeared in her pajamas, supposedly going to the bathroom, but clearly checking on them. She climbed onto the couch without asking permission, wedging herself between them with the confidence of someone who knew she belonged there. "Are you sad? It's supposed to be a happy day." Catherine pulled Harper close, her voice thick with emotion. "Happy tears, sweetheart. Your mom wrote me a letter." Harper's eyes went wide. "Really? What did she say?" "She said I should take care of your dad and make sure he doesn't work too much, and that you're the most special girl in the world." Harper processed this with her characteristic seriousness, then asked the question with a simple 8-year-old logic. "So you're going to stay like forever stay?" Catherine and Jake exchanged a look over their daughter's head. He saw his own hope reflected in her eyes, the terrifying, wonderful possibility of forever. Would that be okay with you? Catherine asked gently. Only if I can call you something. Not Catherine anymore. It feels wrong now. Jake's heart started racing. They hadn't discussed this, hadn't prepared for Harper to broach the subject so directly. What would you like to call me? Harper's answer came without hesitation, like she'd been thinking about it for weeks and just waiting for permission to ask. Can I call you Mom, not instead of my real mom? Dr. Sinclair says I can have two moms, one in heaven and one here. Catherine's composure shattered completely. She pulled Harper into a fierce hug while tears streamed down her face, nodding because words were impossible. Jake wrapped his arms around both his girls, feeling something fundamental settle into place. A family wasn't about replacing what was lost. It was about choosing to love again, despite the risk about hearts being big enough to hold both grief and joy, memory and hope. The summer passed in a blur of work and domesticity, and slowly building towards something Jake couldn't quite name. Catherine essentially lived at his house now, her penthouse becoming a place she visited occasionally for clothes rather than where she actually existed. They fell into routines that felt permanent, Catherine making coffee while Jake got Harper ready for summer camp family dinners, followed by walks around the neighborhood, Harper's bedtime stories now a tag team effort. September arrived with the kind of perfect weather that made Boston bearable, warm days and cool nights that promised autumn without delivering it yet. Jake had been planning the proposal for weeks, orchestrating an elaborate evening at the restaurant where he and Catherine had their first real date. He'd coordinated with the staff, hired a photographer, even picked out a ring with Connor's help. Everything went wrong. Harper woke up that morning with a fever and stomach bug that derailed any plans involving leaving the house. The restaurant called to report a burst pipe had flooded their dining room. The photographer's car broke down on the highway. By evening, Jake was sitting on his couch in sweatpants, while Catherine brought soup for Harper and resignation for him. I had this whole plan, he admitted, watching Catherine settle beside him with the comfortable intimacy of 9 months together. Perfect proposal at a fancy restaurant, photographer to capture the moment. The works. Catherine laughed, the sound soft and genuine. And instead, you got food poisoning and burst pipes. Apparently, the universe has opinions about my romantic gestures. Harper emerged from her bedroom in her favorite pajamas, looking marginally less miserable than she had that morning. She flopped onto the couch between them with the dramatic exhaustion of someone who'd spent the day violently ill. Are you guys talking about mushy stuff? Dad was about to propose to me, but everything went wrong. Harper sat up straight, fever apparently forgotten in the face of this development. Wait, really? Like getting married propose? Jake felt his carefully planned moment slipping away, entirely replaced by chaos and sweatpants and a daughter who was supposed to be in bed. He started to suggest they talk about it later, when everything wasn't falling apart. Then he looked at Catherine, really looked at her. No makeup, hair in a messy ponytail, wearing the yoga pants she kept at his house. She was holding soup she'd brought for his sick daughter, sitting on a secondhand couch in the house that was too small and too cluttered and absolutely nothing like the penthouse she could afford. And she looked happy, genuinely completely happy. Something shifted in Jake's chest, clarity cutting through his anxiety about perfect moments and romantic gestures. This was the moment. Not despite the chaos, but because of it. Because Catherine had chosen them not when they were polished and impressive, but when they were messy and real and slightly disaster-prone. He slid off the couch and onto one knee on his living room floor, pulling the ring box from his pocket. Catherine's eyes went wide, one hand covering her mouth. Catherine Hartfield Reynolds, this wasn't how I planned this. I was going to give you champagne and roses and a photographer to capture everything perfectly. Instead, you're getting sweatpants and soup and a kid who might throw up again at any moment. Harper made an indignant noise but didn't interrupt. But that's actually perfect because this is who we are. We're messy and complicated, and nothing about us has been conventional from the beginning. That text message that started everything was the worst mistake I ever made, and somehow it led to the best thing in my life. He opened the ring box, revealing the simple platinum band with 3 small diamonds, one for each of them, the jeweler had suggested. You didn't just love me, you loved Harper. You honored Sarah's memory instead of being threatened by it. You made us a family when I didn't think I'd ever have one again. So I'm asking you here in my living room in our sweatpants, with our daughter as witness, will you marry me? Catherine was crying too hard to speak, nodding frantically while tears streamed down her face. She finally managed to choke out words. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. This moment is perfect because it's real, because it's us. Jake slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a kiss, while Harper made exaggerated gagging noises from the couch. When they finally broke apart, Catherine turned to Harper with an expression of nervous hope. So you're really okay with this? With me marrying your dad? Harper answered with characteristic bluntness. Can I ask you something first? Anything. When you marry Daddy, can I officially call you Mom like all the time? The question hung in the air, weighted with everything Harper had lost and everything they'd built together. Catherine pulled the little girl into her lap, both of them crying now. Harper, I would be honored beyond words. But you know I'll never replace your first mom, right? I know, Doc Sinclair explained it really good. I can have two moms, one who gave birth to me and lives in heaven, and one who chose to love me even though she didn't have to. And you chose us, Mom. That makes you just as real. Jake wrapped his arms around both of them, feeling his heart expand to accommodate joy he hadn't thought possible 3 years ago. A family forged through loss and choice, and accidental text messages bound together by something stronger than biology or obligation. The engagement party happened 2 weeks later at Connor's house, a casual backyard barbecue that felt more authentic than any formal celebration. Harper appointed herself official announcement maker, dragging everyone's attention with 8-year-old authority to proclaim that her dad and her mom were getting married, and everyone should be very excited about it. Catherine's father, Robert, made his first public appearance since his stroke, moving slowly but smiling genuinely as he pulled Jake aside. Take care of her. She's stronger than she knows, but she's been carrying weight alone for too long. I will. We both will. Robert's eyes grew distant, grief shadowing his features. I should have protected Elizabeth better. Should have seen what Richard was capable of. Jake didn't have words adequate to that kind of regret, so he simply gripped the older man's shoulder in silent understanding. Some wounds didn't heal, just became part of the landscape you learned to navigate. The wedding was planned for November, exactly 14 months after Jake's catastrophic text message. Catherine wanted small and intimate, just close family and friends in the botanical garden where Jake and Sarah had gotten married. The location had required a difficult conversation. Was Jake sure he wanted to marry Catherine in the same place he'd married his first wife? But Harper had been the one to suggest it with the kind of emotional wisdom that continued to amaze both adults. Mommy loved that garden. She'd wanted to have happy memories again. The ceremony happened on a crisp November Saturday, the gardens decorated with late-season flowers and fairy lights. Harper served as junior bridesmaid, carrying a small locket with Sarah's picture tucked inside her bouquet. Catherine had insisted on the detail, another way of honoring the woman who'd made their family possible. Connor stood as best man his toast later, earning simultaneous laughter and tears with his recounting of Jake's panicked phone call the morning after the text message. Robert walked Catherine down the aisle, leaning heavily on a cane but radiating pride. The vows they'd written felt almost inadequate to capture everything they meant to each other. Jake's hands shook as he promised to honor Catherine's strength while protecting her vulnerability, to be partner and support and fellow traveler through whatever came next. Catherine's voice broke as she vowed to love Harper as fiercely as she loved Jake, to honor Sarah's memory while building new traditions to choose their family every day, even when choosing was difficult. When the officiant pronounced them married, Harper cheered loudly enough to make several guests laugh. The kiss Jake and Catherine shared tasted like tears and promise, and the particular sweetness of second chances earned through pain. The reception flowed with the easy warmth of people who genuinely cared about the couple celebrating. Harper gave a toast that was equal parts sweet and hilarious, explaining how her mom made her dad smile different and let her eat ice cream before dinner sometimes, and was basically the best thing ever. The first dance happened to a song Catherine had chosen, something about finding love when you'd stopped looking for it. Jake held his wife, and marveled at the improbability of their journey. From mistaken text to catastrophic board meeting to standing here married and whole and building something beautiful from broken pieces. Later, during the father-daughter dance that had been their tradition at every formal event, Harper surprised him by asking if Catherine could cut in. The three of them swayed together on the dance floor, a family unit that had seemed impossible just a year ago. The send-off happened as twilight turned to full dark guests showering them with flower petals as they headed to Jake's car. Catherine had insisted on a family honeymoon rather than a romantic getaway 2 weeks at Disney World with Harper, because building memories together mattered more than convention. Harper fell asleep in the back seat within 20 minutes, exhausted from excitement and cake. Catherine watched her with an expression of pure tenderness. Best day ever, Jake squeezed her hand. Best year ever, and it's only getting better. 2 years slipped by with the particular speed of happiness, days blurring into months into seasons. Reynolds Media Group flourished under Catherine's leadership, the board's confidence fully restored by consistent growth and ethical transparency. Jake's marketing campaigns won industry awards. Harper thrived in fifth grade, her anxiety managed, and her confidence growing. The pregnancy announcement came as a surprise to everyone, including Catherine, who'd been so focused on building her career that motherhood had remained theoretical rather than planned. But Jake would never forget the expression on her face when she showed him the positive test terror and joy mixing in equal measure. I don't know how to do this. What if I'm terrible at it? Jake pulled her close, one hand already resting protectively over her still flat stomach. You've been mothering Harper for 2 years. You're already great at it. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, Catherine working until her 8th month before finally accepting that board meetings and morning sickness weren't compatible. Harper was thrilled about becoming a big sister, though her excitement manifested in slightly overwhelming enthusiasm about helping with everything. Their daughter arrived in June during a heat wave that made Boston feel like the tropics, 6 pounds of squalling indignation who immediately captured her entire family's hearts. They named her Emma, not after anyone in particular, just because Catherine had always loved the name, and Harper approved of the choice. The November afternoon, 2 years after their wedding, found Jake working from home while Harper did homework at the kitchen table. The house felt comfortably chaotic, toys scattered, and dishes in the sink, and all the evidence of a life fully lived. The baby monitor crackled with the sound of Catherine singing a lullaby, her voice soft and slightly off-key. Jake climbed the stairs to find his wife in the nursery rocking their 6-month-old daughter, while late afternoon light streamed through the windows. Emma had finally surrendered to sleep after fighting her nap for an hour. Catherine looked up as Jake entered, exhaustion and contentment mixing on her face. She's down. Finally. He crossed the room and kissed his wife gently, careful not to wake the baby. You're amazing. I'm exhausted. There's a difference. But she was smiling, the kind of genuine happiness that came from purpose and connection and family. Jake thought about the journey that had brought them here, the catastrophic text message, Richard's betrayal, the board meeting that almost destroyed everything, Harper's tentative acceptance growing into fierce love. Sometimes life's biggest mistakes led to its greatest blessings. Sometimes hearts broken by loss could heal and expand to hold new love. Sometimes families were built not through biology alone, but through choice and courage and commitment to loving, even when love felt impossible. The photo wall in their hallway told the story better than words ever could. Sarah's picture held a place of honor, the first image anyone saw when entering. Then came photos of Jake and Harper in those dark early years. Catherine's first appearance during the Christmas tree decorating, the engagement on their living room floor, the wedding in the botanical garden, Harper's school performances, and Catherine's business achievements, and Emma's first moments. Each photograph a moment captured a memory, preserved a piece of the improbable journey that had brought them from grief and loneliness to this, a family built on foundation of loss but defined by love. Jake carefully took Emma from Catherine's arms and settled his sleeping daughter into her crib. The baby's face was peaceful, completely unaware of how much love surrounded her, how many people had fought to build the family she'd been born into. Harper appeared in the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder. Dad, can you help with my math homework? It's fractions and they make no sense. In a minute, sweetheart. Catherine stood and stretched her hand, finding Jake's naturally. They stood together, watching their daughters, one asleep, one impatient and feeling the weight of gratitude for second chances, in text messages sent to wrong numbers, and the courage to choose love even when it seemed impossible. What are you thinking? Catherine asked softly. Jake pulled her close, breathing in the scent that had become home. I'm thinking about how I almost deleted that text message, how close I came to never sending it at all. Best mistake you ever made. Best mistake we ever made, he corrected, kissing her temple. Together. They walked downstairs hand in hand to help a Harper with fractions and start dinner and navigate the beautiful ordinary chaos of family life. The journey from that September morning in his car to this November afternoon had been anything but straightforward, marked by tragedy and triumph, loss and discovery, endings and beginnings. But standing in his kitchen, watching Catherine explain fractions to Harper, while Emma's soft breathing filtered through the baby monitor, Jake understood something fundamental about the architecture of happiness. It wasn't built on perfection or ease or the absence of pain. It was constructed from resilience and choice, from the willingness to love again after loss, from the courage to believe that broken hearts could heal and broken families could be rebuilt into something stronger than before. The text message that started everything was framed on their bedroom wall, now a reminder that sometimes fate disguised itself as human error. Sometimes the worst moments led to the best outcomes. Sometimes you just needed to be brave enough to face your mistakes instead of running from them. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those mistakes led you exactly where you needed to be.